In 1972, Leroy Nicky Barnes formed the council to manage and supervise the distribution of drugs in Manhattan, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. The council was based on a democratic format, with one vote per man, with each of the members a subsidiary company. Whereas La Cosa Nostra was formed upon a tenet of Catholicism, Barnes built the commission, using aspects of Black nationalism. Two of his alleged top deputies were Guy Fisher and Frank James. Barnes was almost 40 years old. Fisher was 23. According to an undercover DEA agent, Louis Diaz, the council was taking in as much as $84 million a year. Guy Fisher is a lesser-known piece of the puzzle when examining the heroin trade in New York City in the mid-70s. Fisher was born in July 1947. Fisher and his 5 siblings grew up in the Lester Patterson houses, one of the first public housing projects, in the Mart Haven section of the Bronx. At the time, it was a melting pot of different ethnic and religious backgrounds. The Patterson houses, and the rest of the South Bronx, began to change in the 1960s when drugs and crime flooded the streets and middle-class families fled. To those who knew Fisher best as a young man, he was in and out of trouble. But, when he was free from the shackles of reform school, Fisher had a knack for selling things. First, it was shopping bags. Then, it was used clothing he bought, which he marked up and sold. Acquisition and product markup were things Fisher inherently understood. Nothing suggested that Nicky Barnes' empire was crumbling. In fact, his Mr. Untouchable moniker seemed more like a fact than braggadocio. He had a record of 13 arrests dating back to 1950, when he was 18. But the system rarely, if ever, got justice. On May 8, 1975, Barnes was acquitted of a bribery charge involving a police officer. In March of 1976, he was acquitted of a murder charge by a Bronx jury. On October 26, he was arrested in the Bronx for possession of a gun, but the charge was dismissed. During that 5-year period, Nicky Barnes was charged with homicide, bribery, drug dealing, and possession of dangerous weapons. However, the only time he had spent in jail was 150 days on various charges while bail was being secured. When the New York Times magazine wrote the now infamous Mr. Untouchable cover in 1977, they used a specific anecdote to illustrate just how brazen and above the law Barnes thought he was. The law finally caught up with Barnes in 1978. He was sentenced to life without parole for his role in the massive and far-reaching drug conspiracy. Despite Barnes' departure, officials in the police department's narcotics bureau said that Harlem was still the center of heroin trafficking in New York area. Fisher and James became his logical successor. With the added attention from both the police and the press, a more thorough composite of James and Fisher began to emerge, albeit a loose one. Beginning in 1958, James had been arrested 6 times on narcotics and other charges, and served a prison sentence for manslaughter. Fisher, then 32, had been arrested 11 times, including on accusations of narcotics conspiracy, assault, and possession of a gun. In 1974, Fisher was pulled over in Lower Manhattan. After a thorough inspection, police found $103,740 in a shopping bag in the trunk. Like Barnes, Fisher was later acquitted of charges that he had attempted to bribe the arresting officers. Fisher utilized lessons he learned from Barnes. For example, the operating cost of flooding the streets with heroin. It took 16 hours to cut 15 kilos of heroin. Instantly, the $150,000 investment was worth $630,000. The operating cost was $170,000, including the cash fees to the women and their apartment guardians. Fisher stood to make $460,000 in profits for every $150,000 he spent. And then there were lessons he didn't want to take with him, like Barnes' opulence, which included 300 new suits, 100 pairs of shoes, 50 leather coats, and 25 hats. Fisher became something of an everyman in the drug trade. Harlem was in a transitional period. One of the stalwarts of the community, albeit a notorious one, was gone, and a shining beacon of hope, the Apollo Theater, was shuttered after the 1,600-seat venue had fallen into disrepair. Even with the doors closed, Harlemites swore they could still hear the crooning from legends who graced the stage. The venue remained a symbol for Harlem's resilience. During the riots of 1935, 1943, and 1966, not a single window pane was broken. The owner at the time of its closing, Robert Schiffman, believed that the venue was too small to compete with what Las Vegas had created. He planned to increase the size by 2,400 seats, add a 400-room hotel, and a rooftop bar called the Cotton Club, rebranding as the Savoy. The estimated price for the renovation was $30 million. The theater briefly reopened in 1978, under new management with shows by Ralph McDonald, Sister Sledge, James Brown, and Bob Marley. However, no one was quite clear who owned the legendary theater. According to law, it was Guy Fisher. According to property records, the Apollo was purchased by the 253 Realty Corporation, and Elmer Morris had signed the mortgage. Elmer Morris was Guy Fisher's stepbrother, and a former Tuckahoe, New York police officer, responsible for providing the council with information about suspected police informants. It's unclear why Fisher didn't want his name on the lease. On one hand, it shows a level of restraint to keep his name off official documentation. On the other hand, his decision to buy the Harlem Landmark seemed to evoke shades of Nicky Barnes, who created a Harlem mythology by giving away turkeys during Thanksgiving. Guy Fisher and Nicky Barnes represent two examples of cause and effect. When Barnes became a confidential informant, he revealed that Fisher and Samuel Jones were involved in the murders of Oswaldo Peterson and Oscar Wilson, who were killed at a Harlem nightclub when council members had suspected the pair of trying to infiltrate the group. In passing sentence, Judge Pollock said that Mr. Barnes's testimony was convincing, devastating, and indeed shocking. He sentenced 4 defendants to life without parole for their convictions on the most serious narcotics charge, operating a continuing criminal enterprise. Fisher and James each received life without parole and 40 years. Morris got 51 years plus $50,000 on the narcotics conspiracy and racketeering convictions. The assistant U.S. attorney said the racketeering convictions against all the defendants included the charges of at least 10 murders carried out by the council. Unlike Barnes, Fisher refused to cooperate with the government. Fisher served 38 years of a life sentence without parole imposed in 1984. In 2020, he argued that his age, health conditions, and the danger posed to him should he contract COVID-19 while in prison, in conjunction with his decades of work to rehabilitate himself, had made him a candidate for a sentence reduction. During his incarceration, he became the first and only inmate in the history of state or the federal prisons to receive 4 degrees while incarcerated, an associate, bachelor, master, and ultimately, a PhD in sociology, in 2008. Thanks to a compassionate release that factored in his health, his risk of contracting COVID-19, and his dedication to rehabilitation, Fisher was released from federal prison in October 2020. He has spent the month since on trying to put his story of the convicted criminal who, despite a life sentence, earned a doctorate in sociology while counseling inmates on how to improve their post-prison lives.